FE fundinfo provide a suite of different ratings for each fund, and they look at different things. So you've got a crown rating that will look at the performance of the fund and how good it's done against its sector. You've got the alpha manager rating, which looks at the actual manager person behind the fund. And you've also got an FE risk score, which will track how risky that fund is. Now, we have done previous tips to explain how the FE risk score works, but on the left-hand side, just do bear in mind under training and guides, you've got a guide on every single one of our ratings here, and each one will load up a specific PDF. So the risk score guide is here. To summarize, everything on our database has an FE risk score. So whether you're looking at a portfolio, a fund, an index, a sector, it doesn't matter. Every single one of them will have, so long as it's got at least 18 months of history, get an FE risk score. Roughly speaking, you're looking at a scale between 0 and 150 when you're looking at funds. Technically, there is no ceiling. It could go on forever. So when we start looking at direct equities like Apple, Google, Facebook, etc., then don't be surprised to see FE risk scores of 2, 3, 4, 500. But when we're looking at funds, 0 to 150. When you're looking at portfolios, probably more 0 to 100 because of the diversification. And to think about it, 0 would be cash, no risk, forgetting inflation risk, but no volatility risk. A cash instrument doesn't go up and down like a yo-yo. And 100 would be the FTSE 100. We've anchored the FTSE at 100 for a couple of main reasons, given that most people would know what the FTSE 100 is and it conveniently has 100 in the title. So we anchor it at 100. And that's the relative benchmark we're using. And when we're starting to look at emerging market funds, again, you expect those to be in the 130, 140, etc. So you can chart these FE risk scores, and it's a nice and easy way of explaining to a client the relative risk of one thing against another, because although we're using the FTSE 100 as that anchor, it doesn't really matter what we're using as the anchor. You've just got to pick something. If you want to create a relative risk score, you've got to have it relative to something. So in the background is the FTSE 100 that's everything's, as I said, anchored to. But doesn't mean you can simply ignore that and simply compare the relative risk of one thing against another. So in my case in front of us here, I've got a fund, Bell Gifford managed, and I want to compare that in terms of risk against its sector. Now I can create scatter charts. They've always been quite popular to look at risk. I look at risk versus performance. But if I specifically want to look at the FE risk score, go down to FE fundinfo risk score chart, and all you've really got to do is select a time period. So if I want to chart over the last year, click on 1 year and click on generate. And the chart that gets created simply shows me that the mixed investment sector, the sector of this fund, has roughly been at about 54, it's currently about 52 over the course of the last year. And our fund in question, Bell Gifford managed, is currently at 75, as you can see at the very bottom there, and it's come up slightly from 68. But all told, it's fairly clear that that fund takes significantly higher risk than the sector average. Worth pointing out that every single weekly point on that chart is essentially looking at the entire 3-year rolling period to generate that FE risk score. So although I'm looking at a year amount of data, it's actually a lot more than that because they're rolling periods built within that chart. Coming back to the main screen, another use case we see a lot of people using these risk scores on is to show the relative risk of a variety of solutions like in-house models or external MPS against someone's existing portfolio. Now we do have a risk profiling tool on analytics, but if an advisor is using a different risk profiling tool, this is quite a nice way of kind of segueing into analytics and explaining the risk profiler says X, and this is how your portfolio compares against the model or the solution that we're recommending against the variety of solutions we have available. So again, if I selected my 5, in this case, model portfolios versus the client portfolio, throw that against the year FE risk score chart and click on generate. And I'll get a visual representation of the risk. So again, if we're thinking of that scale between 0 and 150, my least riskiest portfolio, my defensive portfolio, is at the very bottom and the most riskiest one at the very top. And these lines shouldn't really touch each other. If I'm managing the portfolios properly, my adventurous portfolio shouldn't just suddenly be balanced. They should be relatively straight lines. And it's a nice way, again, of quickly showing my client, look, if I'm on a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, it doesn't really matter. But on my scale, I've got 5 model portfolios. I've got a risk profile 1 all the way to risk profile 5. And maybe my client's risk profile has come out as a risk profile 4. And therefore, it's quite an easy visual for my client to compute in their head that we're recommending the risk profile for solution, which should be taking this level of risk, and their current investment solution that they have in provider A, B, and C is taking the level of risk akin to a risk profile to solution. So whatever happens going forward, they shouldn't be investing in their current solution. They should be thinking about a solution that takes the level of risk akin to what we've already discussed with the risk profile. And that works any way around. Maybe that red line is at the very top. It's a very quick and easy way of showing the client how much risk they're currently taking with their existing solution without having to talk about performance, and show them, again, based on the risk profile they've just completed, they've just told us they're defensive. So therefore, they can clearly see they're taking far too much risk, and they should be thinking about a portfolio down here. And again, remember, everything has an FE risk score. So if I create a portfolio of direct equities, that will allow me to show the client the relative risk of a direct equity portfolio compared to a fund portfolio, and expect to see those equities high up on the chart. So I hope you found that tip useful. As I've mentioned earlier, if you do need to have a look at some of the guides, then they're over there on the left-hand side. And in addition to the guides, we've got our training team, so feel free to schedule a training session with those guys. Also contact us at the very bottom. That will give you details to our help desk. And on the far right-hand side, you've got live chat, so you can talk to our help desk digitally.